When you've never been outside. 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 When you've never been outside.
My friend, it is Friday the 13th of March in the year 2020. The sky is a scuddy blue. Today the United Kingdom of America is in the clammy grip of an incipient virus called COVID-19, or my corona as it is commonly referred to. My life goes on, and the government just announced that many people will lose those dear to them prematurely. Now this sounded like a sort of kind and caring statement, with the soft reassuring tones of a vicar or a priest at a memorial service, when it was transmitted into the homes of the people of literal land. But something about it did not feel right. Most of the announcements made by the authorities have this feeling of being staged after lengthy directorial meetings, but this felt very odd. This feeling is similar to the way I imagine a dog senses something is not right. Or at least that's how it seems in films, when the owner of said dog either turns to the dog and tells them to quieten down, and we the viewer see the shadow of the killer, or they say, "What's up, boy, what's wrong?" just before the axe splits their head asunder. I'm not saying that there aren't many things about living in literal land that make me feel uneasy, but this statement did not feel right at all. It had the feeling of us covering about it. That is, being seen to do something about something when you are not doing anything to actually help, but no one can complain because you are doing something. It also felt like a bit of an attempt to channel what people in literal land know as a Churchillian spirit, which is the spirit named after the ghost of a once famous leader of literal land who was inspiring during a time of a national crisis called the Second World War, when people fought for the right to measure time in seconds rather than revert to sundials and bell ringing as the nasties had wanted us to do in the middle of the last century. I am not ill, although I have some phlegm. However, I am not going to panic buy toilet paper yet, because I've found that these days I can usually hawk it up and spit it out into a cup. In the last century before last, people still had wonderful ornate objects called spittoons for just such a practical dispatching of bodily excretions, but now in the modern time of literal land, we do not, so I make do with a cup instead. I have to remember not to leave it like that on the draining board, or otherwise my wife will experience severe nausea and may have to self-quarantine as a precaution, even though it's obviously my phlegm that made her feel sick and not my corona. I know she has kissed me, and we have made 2 babies together, but she still feels sick at the sight of my pale green phlegm. I mention the color because I am one of the few people who consider themselves rational in literal land, who have some kind of belief in the effectiveness of homeopathic remedies. With homeopathy, the color of your phlegm can tell you a lot about which particular remedy will be effective. I remember my school science teacher N.T. Haley telling the class about when he contracted tuberculosis and he failed to check his phlegm and ended up throwing away the tissue containing the lump of TB, and if he had checked it, they might have been able to save him. This story confused me, and in fact it still does, not knowing much about how tuberculosis works, and I would like someone CNC like Mr. Haley to explain what he meant. Also, when I was at school in the last century, I still didn't wear hearing aids, so I was a little bit like a superstitious medieval man who only heard a bit of what was being said and made up the rest. I was confused because obviously Mr. Haley, with his face-to-face and heroic jawline, had lived to tell the tale. This remains the only part of this science lessons that I remember. Science is the first illuminated letter of what the authorities of literal land call STEM. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering and maths. This way of making words from the first letter of several words is called an anacronym. Anacronyms are a useful way of remembering things, or at least they were until the authorities introduced Googling things and allowed people to forget how to remember things. So now anacronyms are mainly useful as a way of people for coming up with dynamic sounding words for projects so that people hearing them believe they know what they are doing. Having created a pedagogic anacronym myself at the end of the last century, I know that what we assume are rational decisions are shaped by the desire to create a satisfying sounding word for the anacronym. I, myself, do not of course object to this because I enjoy the logic of rhyme, and in literal land rhyme is strictly a whimsical appendage to reason. Rhyming in literal land is only useful for writing generic pop songs about overcoming the hardships of your upbringing to go on and become rich with a nice car, or perhaps to explain how you would like a hot boyfriend who can make you happy. Science, technology, engineering and maths are nothing to do with rhyming in literal land. I have to admit that this is a very effective anacronym because it promotes the sense that these subjects are a fundamental essence to the effective development of human capabilities. It's the essence, like a stem cell, that can grow new life through scientific empowerment. Some people in literal land who like to try on the idea of the vestige of being subversive have suggested that this anacronym be made into STEAM. This is curious because steampunk is a form of rebellion authorized by the government of literal land because it harnesses the nostalgia for the century before the last century, when literal land was a powerful industrial empire. Steampunk gives people a cozy feeling of being a fantasy rebel. The A of the word STEAM comes from adding the word art to the anacronym. Here we have the idea that art is literally an appendage to the really real world of science. Welcome to literal land. We have science people on the television talking about how we need to flatten the spike in the graph of the virus. This means the sudden increase in actual people dying from effects of the virus on breathing. So science people are not permitted to suggest what we actually do to flatten the spike in the graph, and it is left to our leader to suggest that we prepare ourselves for losing those dear to us prematurely.
When you've never been outside, when you've never been outside.